The encounter. The fluorescent lights of Logan International Airport in Boston cast a stark glow over the bustling terminal. Daniel Hayes, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and an air of self-importance, strode through the crowd with his carry-on bag trailing behind him. His tailored suit, crisp shirt, and polished leather shoes marked him as a man accustomed to power. The airport's familiar chaos, families wrangling toddlers, flight announcements echoing overhead, and the faint hum of endless conversations, barely registered as he weaved expertly through the throng. Daniel glanced at his watch, a luxury timepiece worth more than most people's monthly salaries, and muttered under his breath, 4:25 p.m. He had just enough time to grab a coffee before boarding his flight to Dallas for a pivotal business meeting. Missing it was not an option. This deal could secure his firm's biggest client yet, and he had spent weeks preparing for it. At the gate, the line to board was already forming. Daniel grabbed his coffee from a nearby kiosk, irritated by the barista's slow service, and made his way to the front of the queue. As a first-class passenger, he was used to certain privileges, priority boarding being one of them. He handed his boarding pass to the attendant, who greeted him with a polite smile that he barely acknowledged. Stepping onto the plane, Daniel was immediately comforted by the hushed tones and wide seats of first class. He settled into 3A, placing his bag neatly in the overhead compartment. He had barely buckled his seatbelt when he heard a voice behind him. "Oh dear, I think I'm in 3B, the voice said, soft yet steady. Daniel turned to see an older black woman, her posture slightly stooped, but her demeanor calm and self-assured. Her gray curls framed a face lined with age and wisdom. She clutched a well-worn tote bag in one hand and a small carry-on in the other. "Excuse me," she said again, smiling warmly. "Would you mind helping me with my bag? These overhead bins are quite high." Daniel hesitated for a moment, a flash of annoyance crossing his face. He had no patience for interruptions, especially from strangers, but with several passengers watching, he sighed and stood up. "Fine," he muttered, taking her bag and shoving it into the compartment. "Thank you," the woman said, seemingly unfazed by his gruffness. She adjusted her scarf, its vibrant colors contrasting against her otherwise simple attire, and settled into her seat beside him. As the plane taxied to the runway, Daniel buried himself in his laptop, reviewing the final details of his presentation. He ignored the woman beside him, who quietly took out a well-thumbed book. But as the plane leveled off, she turned to him with a kind smile. "Traveling for work?" she asked. Daniel looked up briefly, his fingers pausing over his keyboard. "Yes," he replied curtly, hoping that would end the conversation. The woman nodded, undeterred. "I'm heading home after visiting my daughter. She just had her first baby, a little girl named Ava. I stayed to help them for a few weeks." Daniel nodded absently, his attention already back on his screen. "Do you have children?" she asked, her tone light but genuinely curious. The question caught him off guard. "No," he said shortly. "Not married." The woman's expression softened. "Ah, I see. Well, life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it." Daniel gave a non-committal grunt and turned back to his laptop, determined to ignore the stranger who seemed intent on chatting. For the next half hour, the woman remained quiet, flipping through her book and occasionally glancing out the window. But Daniel could feel her presence beside him, a quiet calm that somehow felt both soothing and unsettling. When the flight attendant came by with drinks, the woman ordered tea and offered Daniel a smile as she sipped it carefully. Just as Daniel thought he could finally focus, the turbulence began. It started with a small jolt, the kind that barely made passengers look up from their magazines. But within moments, the plane began to shudder violently, causing drinks to spill and passengers to grip their armrests. A child cried out somewhere in economy, and the flight attendants moved swiftly to secure the cabin. Daniel's heart raced as the plane dipped suddenly, his coffee tipping over onto his laptop. He cursed under his breath, but the older woman beside him placed a steady hand on his arm. "Breathe," she said softly, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. "This will pass." Daniel looked at her, startled by her composure. She was still holding her teacup, though the liquid inside trembled with each shudder of the plane. Her other hand rested lightly on a small silver locket around her neck. "Are you not afraid?" he asked, his voice tense. She smiled, her eyes meeting his. "Of course I am. But fear won't help us now. We just have to ride it out." Her words, simple yet profound, stayed with Daniel as the turbulence gradually subsided. When the captain announced that they had reached smoother air, the cabin filled with relieved sighs and nervous laughter. Daniel realized his hands were trembling and quickly clasped them together, feeling embarrassed. The woman beside him glanced at him with a knowing look. "Sometimes a little perspective can go a long way," she said. Daniel didn't respond, but her words lingered. He found himself stealing glances at her for the remainder of the flight, curious about the quiet strength she seemed to carry. When the plane landed, Daniel was eager to disembark and put the unsettling experience behind him. But as they waited to deplane, he noticed the woman struggling with her bag again. This time, he didn't hesitate to help. "Thank you," she said, her smile as warm as ever. As they stepped into the terminal, Daniel was ready to part ways when he noticed the woman stumble. She clutched her chest, her face contorting in pain, and collapsed to the floor. "Mom!" Daniel shouted, dropping his bag as he rushed to her side. The bustling terminal seemed to freeze as people turned to look. A man pushed through the crowd, his face pale with worry. "That's my mother," he said, kneeling beside her. He turned to Daniel, his voice firm. "What happened?" Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. All he could think about was the woman's steady voice during the turbulence and the kindness she had shown him, even when he didn't deserve it. In that moment, Daniel realized that the stranger beside him had left an indelible mark on him, and he might never get the chance to thank her. The revelation. The terminal erupted into chaos as the elderly woman, now unconscious, lay on the polished floor. Daniel knelt beside her, his mind racing. A few feet away, her son barked instructions to the gathering crowd. "Someone call 911. We need a medic." His voice cracked with urgency, drawing a handful of onlookers to action. Daniel glanced at her face, calm, almost serene despite the situation. Her silver locket glinted under the harsh airport lights, catching his attention. It was open now, revealing a tiny photograph inside. He could barely make out the smiling faces of what seemed to be two children and a younger version of the woman lying before him. "Is she breathing?" a passerby asked, crouching nearby. A nurse, judging by her scrubs and calm demeanor, took over the situation. "Yes," Daniel replied, his voice shaky. "I think so." He watched as the nurse checked her pulse and gently tilted her head back, ensuring her airway was clear. The woman's son, James, as Daniel would later learn, remained rooted beside her, his hand gripping hers tightly. "She has a heart condition," James explained, his voice thick with emotion. "She's been overdoing it lately. I told her to take it easy, but she never listens." His words were tinged with frustration, but it was clear that his concern outweighed any anger. Daniel felt a pang of guilt. During the flight, he had dismissed her as an annoyance, barely tolerating her attempts at conversation. Now, watching her vulnerable form on the floor, he felt the weight of his own selfishness. He had been so absorbed in his work, his deadlines, and his ambition that he hadn't even bothered to learn her name. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their presence breaking the stillness of the moment. They worked quickly, checking her vitals and preparing her for transport. James followed every movement closely, his knuckles white as he gripped his mother's belongings, a simple tote bag and her book, the cover bent and worn. As the paramedics lifted her onto a stretcher, James turned to Daniel. "Thank you for helping," he said, his tone earnest but strained. Daniel hesitated, unsure of what to say. "It's the least I could do," he replied, feeling the inadequacy of his words. He wanted to apologize for his earlier behavior, but couldn't bring himself to do it in the middle of the chaotic scene. "I'm going to the hospital with her," James continued. "You don't have to stay." Daniel opened his mouth to agree, to excuse himself and catch his next flight. But something in James's expression, a mixture of desperation and determination, stopped him. Instead, he found himself saying, "I'll come with you." The words surprised even him. He wasn't the type to go out of his way for strangers, especially when it meant jeopardizing his carefully laid plans. But something about the woman, her quiet strength, her unwavering kindness, compelled him to stay. The ride to the hospital was a blur. Daniel sat in the back of the ambulance, feeling out of place among the medical equipment and the quiet urgency of the paramedics' work. James sat beside his mother, holding her hand and murmuring reassurances she couldn't hear. At the hospital, the fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell assaulted Daniel's senses as they wheeled her into the emergency room. James disappeared with the medical staff, leaving Daniel alone in the waiting area. He sank into one of the plastic chairs, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Time dragged on. Daniel checked his watch repeatedly, his thoughts a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He had emails to send, calls to make, and a presentation that was growing less important by the minute. For the first time in years, his career didn't feel like the most pressing thing in his life. James returned after what felt like hours, his face pale but calm. "She's stable," he said, sitting down heavily beside Daniel. "The doctors say she'll need to stay overnight for observation, but they think she'll be okay." Daniel exhaled, relief washing over him. "That's good to hear." James nodded, staring at the floor. "She's always pushing herself too hard. Volunteering, helping people. She doesn't know how to stop." He looked up at Daniel, his expression a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. "Thanks for staying. You didn't have to." Daniel shrugged, feeling awkward. It didn't feel right to leave. They sat in silence for a moment before James spoke again. "She's incredible, you know. Always putting others first, even when it costs her. It's frustrating sometimes, but I wouldn't want her to change." Daniel thought back to the flight, to the way she had comforted the frightened passenger during the turbulence, despite her own obvious fear. He had dismissed her then, but now he saw her in a completely different light. "What's her name?" Daniel asked suddenly, realizing he didn't even know. "Margaret," James replied with a small smile. "Margaret Woods." The name felt significant, though Daniel couldn't explain why. He nodded, committing it to memory. Hours passed, and Daniel found himself pacing the waiting room, his thoughts churning. Margaret's strength and selflessness had struck a chord deep within him, forcing him to confront his own choices. He thought about the countless hours he had spent chasing success, the relationships he had neglected, and the people he had hurt along the way. When James returned from checking on his mother, Daniel turned to him. "Can I see her?" James hesitated, then nodded. "She's awake now. I think she'd like to see you." Daniel followed James down the sterile hallway, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure what he would say to her or why it felt so important. But as he stepped into her room and saw her sitting up in bed, her face pale but smiling, he felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. "Hello, Mr. Hayes," Margaret said, her voice soft but steady. "I hear you've been quite the gentleman today." Daniel's throat tightened. "I wouldn't say that," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But I wanted to thank you." Her eyebrows lifted in surprise. "For what?" "For being you," Daniel said simply. "For showing me what really matters." Margaret smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Well, it's never too late to start focusing on what's important." Daniel nodded, her words resonating deeply. He didn't know how, but he felt certain his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Confronting regrets. The hospital's fluorescent lights reflected harshly off the pristine white walls as Daniel sat at Margaret Woods's bedside. The rhythmic beep of her heart monitor filled the room, a steady reminder of her fragility. Margaret had drifted off to sleep, her face peaceful despite the earlier chaos. Her silver locket rested on the tray table beside her, catching the dim light with every small movement of the IV stand nearby. Daniel leaned back in the uncomfortable chair, staring at her. Margaret had barely spoken to him before exhaustion overtook her, but the few words she had shared carried a weight that unsettled him. "It's never too late to start focusing on what's important," she had said with a gentle smile, her voice tinged with both wisdom and weariness. He hadn't been able to respond, too overwhelmed by the simplicity and truth of her statement. Now, as he sat alone in the quiet room, her words echoed in his mind, peeling back layers of his carefully constructed life. For years, Daniel had believed success was measured in numbers. Contracts closed, promotions earned, bank balances swollen. He had climbed the corporate ladder with single-minded determination, leaving relationships and personal connections in the dust. A memory resurfaces. As he sat there, the weight of his past choices began to press down on him. His thoughts wandered to his parents, specifically his mother, who had passed away 3 years earlier. The memory was as vivid as it was painful. He had been in New York at the time, finalizing a merger that would secure him a coveted senior position. When his sister called to tell him their mother had been admitted to the hospital with severe pneumonia, he had brushed it off. "She'll be fine," he had said, pacing his hotel room with a phone pressed to his ear. "Mum's tough. She always bounces back." "Daniel, you don't understand," his sister had pleaded. "The doctor said it's serious. You need to come home." But he hadn't. He'd stayed to finish the deal, convincing himself it was the right decision. When his sister called again 2 days later to tell him their mother had passed, Daniel had been in the middle of a celebratory dinner with his colleagues. The memory of his sister's sobs on the other end of the line still haunted him. Now, sitting in Margaret's hospital room, Daniel felt the familiar ache of regret. He had told himself for years that he couldn't have known how serious the situation was, that his mother wouldn't have wanted him to jeopardize his career. But deep down, he knew those were just excuses. The truth was, he had chosen his ambition over his family. A new perspective. Margaret stirred slightly in her sleep, her hand brushing against the blanket. The movement brought Daniel back to the present. He glanced at the locket on the table and hesitated for a moment before picking it up. The photograph inside showed Margaret holding 2 children, James, undoubtedly, and a young girl. Their smiles were wide and genuine, a testament to the love that radiated from the woman lying before him. "Family," Daniel muttered under his breath, the word feeling foreign yet significant. He placed the locket back on the table carefully, as if it were a fragile artifact. James entered the room, his footsteps soft against the tiled floor. He carried 2 paper cups of coffee, one of which he handed to Daniel. "Figured you might need this," he said, sitting down on the other side of the bed. "Thanks," Daniel replied, taking the cup but not drinking from it. He stared at James, noticing the dark circles under his eyes and the tension in his posture. "You're a good son," Daniel said suddenly. James looked up, startled. "What?" "I've been watching you," Daniel continued, his voice low but earnest. "The way you've been here for her, the way you stayed calm during everything. I can see how much you care. She's lucky to have you." James gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. "Lucky? I don't know about that. Half the time, I feel like I'm just trying to keep up with her. She's always been the strong one, not me." "That's not what I've seen," Daniel said. "It takes strength to be here, to care the way you do. A lot of people wouldn't bother." James shrugged, his expression turning thoughtful. "She taught me that. Mom's always been about showing up for people, no matter how hard it gets. She says it's what connects us, being there for one another." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. How many times had he failed to show up? For his family, his friends, even for himself. He had been so focused on climbing higher that he hadn't noticed how isolated he had become. A moment of honesty. James, Daniel began hesitantly. Can I ask you something? Sure. How do you do it? How do you keep showing up, even when it's hard? James leaned back in his chair, considering the question. It's not easy, he admitted. Sometimes, I don't want to. When my dad died, I was so angry at the world. I didn't want to feel anything, let alone take care of anyone else. But Mom, she never let me shut down. She told me that pain can either break us or build us, and it's up to us to decide which. I guess I decided I didn't want to be broken. Daniel nodded slowly, his respect for James growing with each passing moment. I think I've been broken for a long time, he confessed. I just didn't realize it until now. James looked at him, his gaze steady. Then maybe it's time to start rebuilding. A silent resolve. Margaret stirred again, her eyes fluttering open. She smiled faintly when she saw James and Daniel sitting on either side of her bed. Well, this is a sight, she said, her voice hoarse but warm. Two handsome men keeping an old lady company. I must be dreaming. James chuckled, leaning forward to take her hand. You're not dreaming, Mom. We're right here. Margaret's gaze shifted to Daniel. And you, she said softly. I didn't expect you to stay. Daniel felt his throat tighten. I couldn't leave, he said simply. Not after everything. Margaret's smile deepened. Sometimes, it takes a storm to show us what really matters. Her words settled over Daniel like a blanket, comforting yet challenging. He realized in that moment that he didn't want to go back to the life he had been living. Something had shifted inside him, and there was no turning back. As Margaret drifted off to sleep again, Daniel made a silent vow to himself. He would rebuild the bridges he had burned, starting with his father. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to try. Margaret's strength had shown him a path he hadn't known he was searching for. Now, it was up to him to walk it. The first step toward healing. The morning sun filtered through the hospital window, casting a golden hue across the room. Margaret's steady breathing filled the quiet space, the gentle rhythm a reminder of her resilience. Daniel stood by the window, looking out at the city skyline. His coffee, now cold, sat forgotten on the sill as he wrestled with the emotions that had been building since the moment Margaret collapsed in the airport. James had stepped out to speak with the doctor, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts. The events of the past 24 hours played on a loop in his mind. Margaret's kindness, her collapse, and the quiet wisdom she imparted even in her moments of vulnerability. Her words, simple but profound, had unraveled years of carefully constructed justifications and forced him to confront the choices he had made. He thought about his father, a man he hadn't spoken to in nearly 4 years. Their estrangement had started with small disagreements about the family business, about tradition, but had grown into a chasm so wide it seemed impossible to bridge. Daniel had told himself he was better off without the weight of his father's expectations, but now, in the stillness of the hospital room, he wondered if the distance had cost him more than he was willing to admit. A voice in the stillness. Margaret stirred, her eyes opening slowly. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft but steady. Daniel turned to face her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Good morning, Mrs. Woods. How are you feeling?" "Tired," she admitted, adjusting her pillow. "But grateful. Every new date is a gift, don't you think?" Daniel nodded, pulling up the chair beside her bed. "I think I'm just starting to understand that." Margaret studied him for a moment, her eyes sharp despite her fatigue. "You've been carrying something heavy," she observed. "I could see it on the plane, even before everything happened. Do you want to talk about it?" Daniel hesitated, the weight of her gaze making it difficult to deflect. He had spent years keeping his emotions buried, but something about Margaret made him feel safe enough to open up. "My father," he began, his voice low. "We haven't spoken in years. We used to be close. He taught me everything I know about hard work, about building something from the ground up. But I wanted something different. I didn't want to take over the family business. I wanted more success, more opportunities. When I told him, it didn't go well. Margaret nodded slowly, encouraging him to continue. We argued, Daniel said, his throat tightening. I said things I didn't mean, and so did he. After that, we just stopped talking. I told myself I was too busy, that I'd call him when things settled down, but they never did. And now I don't even know if he'd want to hear from me. Margaret reached out and placed a hand on his, her touch warm and reassuring. It's never too late, Daniel, she said gently. Pain can create distance, but love has a way of bridging even the widest gaps. The question is, are you willing to take the first step? A call worth making. Daniel left the hospital room a few hours later, his heart heavy with Margaret's words. He found himself standing outside in the crisp morning air, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. For a long moment he stared at the screen, his father's name and number glaring back at him. It had been so long since they'd spoken that Daniel wasn't even sure if the number was still valid. His thumb hovered over the call button, his chest tightening with a mix of fear and hope. Finally, he pressed it, holding the phone to his ear as it rang. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. Just as he was about to hang up, a gruff voice answered. Hello. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. His father's voice was deeper than he remembered, but it was unmistakably him. Dad, Daniel said, his voice trembling. It's me, Daniel. A long silence followed. When his father finally spoke, his tone was cautious. What do you want? Daniel closed his eyes, the weight of his guilt threatening to overwhelm him. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. For walking away, for not calling. I know I hurt you, and I hate that it took me this long to realize it. His father didn't respond immediately, and Daniel braced himself for rejection. But then, to his surprise, he heard a sigh on the other end of the line. Do you mean that? His father asked quietly. I do, Daniel replied. I've been so focused on work, on success, that I forgot what really matters. I want to fix things, Dad, if you'll let me. There was another pause, and then his father's voice softened. I've missed you, Daniel. More than I can say. If you're willing to try, so am I. Daniel's shoulders sagged with relief, tears welling in his eyes. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I've missed you too. A new beginning. When Daniel returned to the hospital, James was sitting in the waiting room, scrolling through his phone. He looked up as Daniel approached. Everything okay? James asked. Daniel nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. Yeah, he said. I think it will be. James studied him for a moment, then nodded. Good. I think Mom's awake if you want to see her. Daniel made his way back to Margaret's room, feeling lighter than he had in years. When he stepped inside, Margaret looked up and smiled. You look like a man who's just had a breakthrough, she said knowingly. Daniel chuckled, sitting down beside her. I called my dad, he admitted. We talked. It wasn't easy, but it felt right. Margaret's smile deepened. I'm proud of you, Daniel. Taking the first step is always the hardest, but it's also the most important. As they sat together, the morning sunlight streaming through the window, Daniel felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Margaret's kindness and wisdom had changed him in ways he hadn't thought possible. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. Rebuilding bridges. The hospital room buzzed faintly with the hum of machines and the occasional footsteps of nurses passing in the hallway. Margaret's gentle presence filled the space, even as she rested. Her steady breathing and serene expression made the room feel calm, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions still swirling within Daniel. Daniel sat at her bedside, his mind replaying his conversation with his father. The words had come harder than any negotiation he'd ever faced in the corporate world, but the relief that followed was immeasurable. His father's voice, tinged with cautious hope, lingered in his mind. I've missed you, Daniel. More than I can say. Margaret stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering open. She turned her head slowly toward him, her eyes warm and full of quiet understanding. "You seem lighter," she observed, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel smiled faintly, pulling his chair closer to the bed. "I called my dad," he said, the words carrying both pride and vulnerability. "It's been years since we've spoken, but I think we're starting to mend things." Margaret's smile widened, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of her blanket. "That's wonderful to hear," she said. "The first step is always the hardest, but it opens the door to so much more." Daniel nodded, feeling a flicker of pride. "I didn't realize how much I missed him until I heard his voice again. He said he missed me too, and it hit me harder than I expected. I'd spent so many years chasing success, thinking that's what mattered most. But now, I'm not so sure." Margaret's gaze softened, and she reached out to place a hand on his. Her touch was warm, grounding him in the present moment. "Sometimes it takes a storm to show us what truly matters," she said gently. "But it's never too late to rebuild." The power of connection. Later that day, James joined them in the room, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a small bag of snacks. He handed 1 cup to Daniel and placed the bag on the side table, then took his seat on the other side of Margaret's bed. His easy movements and calm demeanor masked the exhaustion that lingered in his eyes. "You've been quiet," James said, looking at Daniel with a curious expression. "What's going on in that head of yours?" Daniel hesitated, unsure of how much to share, but after a moment, he decided to be honest. "I've been thinking about how disconnected I've let myself become," he admitted, "from my family, from the people around me. I've been so focused on my career that I've missed everything else." James leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly. "That's easy to do in this world. Everyone's always pushing to get ahead, to be better, faster, more successful. It's like we forget how to just be." Margaret, her voice soft but steady, chimed in. "Connection is what makes us human. Without it, all the success in the world feels hollow. But when we let ourselves connect, with family, with strangers, with ourselves, that's when we find real meaning." Her words hung in the air, wrapping around Daniel like a comforting blanket. He thought about the missed holidays, the strained relationships, the opportunities for connection he had let slip away. For the first time, he felt a deep desire to change. A glimpse into Margaret's world. Curious about Margaret's life, Daniel turned to her. "James mentioned that you've spent your life helping others. Why did you choose that path?" Margaret's eyes brightened, a spark of energy returning to her tired features. "After my husband passed, I was lost," she began. "I had 2 young children, and no idea how I was going to make it. But then something incredible happened. People showed up. Neighbors, friends, even strangers. They brought food, helped with the kids, and offered their support in ways I never expected." She paused, her gaze distant, as if she were reliving those moments. "Their kindness saved me. It gave me hope when I had none. And I realized that if I could ever give that kind of hope to someone else, I would." Daniel listened intently as Margaret described the countless lives she had touched over the years, volunteering in disaster zones, organizing food drives, mentoring young mothers, and simply being a steady presence for those in need. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, each story painting a vivid picture of a life dedicated to service. "It wasn't always easy," Margaret admitted, her tone softening. "But every act of kindness, no matter how small, felt like a stitch mending the fabric of my own heart." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. "You've done so much for so many people," he said, his voice tinged with awe. "Do you ever feel drained?" Margaret smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Sometimes. But the thing about giving is that it fills you up in ways you don't expect. The more you give, the more you realize how much you have to offer." A spark of inspiration. As the day wore on, Daniel found himself reflecting on Margaret's words. Her life, though far removed from his own, resonated deeply with him. He thought about the opportunities he had to make a difference, not just in his career but in the lives of the people around him. When James stepped out to take a call, Daniel turned to Margaret. "I want to do more," he said, his voice steady. "I don't just want to rebuild my relationship with my father. I want to be better. For him, for myself, for the people I'd let down." Margaret's smile was warm and encouraging. "Then start now," she said simply. "Every moment is a chance to begin again." A letter to the past. That evening, back at his hotel, Daniel sat at the small desk in his room, a blank sheet of paper in front of him. He picked up a pen and began to write. "Dear Dad, I don't know where to begin, but I guess I'm sorry is a good start. I'm sorry for the things I said, for walking away, and for not reaching out sooner. I thought I was doing the right thing, chasing my dreams, but I see now that I let my ambition come between us. I want to fix things, Dad. I want to rebuild what we had. I know it won't be easy, and I know it will take time, but I'm willing to do the work if you are. You've always been my role model, even when I didn't act like it. I miss you. I hope we can find our way back to each other. With love, Daniel." As he folded the letter and placed it in an envelope, Daniel felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. Margaret's strength and wisdom had sparked something in him, a determination to change, to heal, and to reconnect. It was only the beginning, but it was a beginning he felt ready to embrace. A journey of redemption. Daniel held the envelope in his hands, staring at it as if it carried the weight of his entire past. The letter to his father wasn't just words on paper. It was an olive branch, a declaration of vulnerability, and a promise to try. For years, he had buried his regrets under the guise of ambition, but now they were surfacing, demanding his attention. He placed the envelope carefully in his briefcase, knowing the next step would be to send it. A conversation with James. The next morning, Daniel returned to the hospital. He found James in the cafeteria, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone. The table was scattered with empty sugar packets and napkins, a testament to a sleepless night. "Mind if I join you?" Daniel asked, holding his own cup of coffee. James gestured to the chair across from him. "Sure." They sat in silence for a moment before Daniel spoke. "I wrote a letter to my dad last night." James looked up, his eyebrows raised in surprise. "Really? That's a big step." Daniel nodded, swirling the coffee in his cup. It felt necessary. "I've spent so long running from the things that matter. I'm tired of it." James leaned back in his chair, studying Daniel. "You know, when I was younger, I used to think my mom was crazy for the way she dropped everything to help people. I'd get annoyed, like, why couldn't she just focus on us? But now I see what she was teaching me. It wasn't just about helping others. It was about staying connected. To the world, to people, to yourself." Daniel nodded, taking in James's words. "Your mom has a way of making you rethink everything," he said with a faint smile. James chuckled. "She does. And she has this uncanny ability to see right through people, doesn't she? Like she knows what you need before you even do." "Exactly," Daniel agreed, his smile growing. "She's remarkable." Margaret's wisdom. When Daniel returned to Margaret's room, she was sitting up in bed, looking out the window. The morning sun bathed her face in warm light, highlighting the lines of experience and wisdom etched into her features. "Ah, there you are," she said, turning to him with a smile. "I was wondering if you'd come back." Daniel sat down beside her, placing his coffee on the side table. "I'm not going anywhere," he said sincerely. "You've taught me too much in the past couple of days to just walk away." Margaret chuckled softly. "Well, I'm glad to hear that. What's on your mind today?" Daniel hesitated for a moment, then said, "I wrote a letter to my dad last night. I haven't sent it yet, but it felt like a step in the right direction." Margaret's eyes sparkled with approval. "That's wonderful, Daniel. Reaching out, even in small ways, can make a world of difference." "I just hope it's not too late," Daniel admitted, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Margaret reached out and placed a hand on his arm. "It's never too late," she said firmly. "Every day we're given is an opportunity to mend, to heal, to grow. Don't let fear stop you from taking that chance." Her words struck a chord deep within him. Daniel realized he had been letting fear dictate his actions for far too long. Fear of rejection, fear of vulnerability, fear of failure. But Margaret's unwavering belief in the power of connection gave him the courage to push past that fear. A visit from the past. Later that day, as Margaret rested, Daniel received a call from his sister. He hadn't spoken to her in months, and the sound of her voice brought a wave of nostalgia. "Daniel," she said, her tone cautious but warm. "Dad told me you called." Daniel's breath hitched. "He did." "Yes," she said. He sounded hopeful, like he's been waiting for this. "I just wanted to say, I'm proud of you." The words hit him harder than he expected. "Thanks," he said softly. "I'm trying." They spoke for a while, reminiscing about their childhood and sharing updates on their lives. It was the first meaningful conversation they'd had in years, and by the end of it, Daniel felt a renewed sense of purpose, a small act of kindness. Before leaving the hospital that evening, Daniel stopped by the gift shop. He picked out a bouquet of bright yellow daisies and a small card. Sitting at a nearby bench, he wrote a simple message. "Margaret, thank you for showing me what truly matters. Your kindness and wisdom have changed my life, and I'll never forget it. With gratitude, Daniel." He placed the card inside the bouquet and carried it to her room. Margaret was awake when he arrived, and her face lit up when she saw the flowers. "For me?" she asked, her voice filled with delight. Daniel nodded, handing them to her. "Just a small thank you for everything you've done. For me and for so many others." Margaret held the bouquet close, her smile radiant. "You didn't have to do this, but it means so much." As they sat together, talking and laughing, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of peace. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about deadlines or deals, or the next big opportunity. He was simply present, savoring the moment and the connections he was rebuilding. A new chapter. When Daniel left the hospital that night, the city lights twinkling around him, he felt like a different man. Margaret's wisdom and kindness had sparked a transformation within him, one he was determined to carry forward. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt ready to face the journey ahead. He looked up at the sky, the stars barely visible through the city haze, and smiled. "It's never too late," he whispered, the words feeling like both a promise and a prayer. With his letter to his father in his pocket and a renewed sense of purpose in his heart, Daniel stepped into the night, ready to rebuild the life he had almost lost. Transformation takes time. The drive to the airport was unusually quiet. Daniel sat in the back seat of the taxi, his gaze fixed on the sprawling cityscape of Boston as it blurred past the window. The events of the past few days replayed in his mind like a movie reel. Margaret's unwavering kindness, her wisdom, and the moments of vulnerability he had shared with her and James. Each scene was a reminder of how much his perspective had shifted. In his hand was the letter to his father, sealed and ready to be mailed. It felt heavier than paper and ink, carrying with it the weight of years of regret and the fragile hope for reconciliation. He hadn't sent it yet, but the decision to write it, to open that door, was already a significant step forward. As the taxi pulled up to the terminal, Daniel took a deep breath and stepped out, his briefcase in one hand and the letter in the other. The busy hum of the airport enveloped him. Voices over intercoms, rolling luggage, and the faint roar of planes taking off in the distance. But for the first time, the noise didn't overwhelm him. Instead, it felt like the background to a new chapter unfolding in his life. An unexpected delay. Inside the terminal, Daniel checked his watch. He had plenty of time before his flight, so he decided to find a quiet corner to sit and reflect. As he walked past a mailbox near a coffee kiosk, he paused. The letter felt heavy in his hand, its significance outweighing its physical weight. He glanced around, his mind racing. Should I mail it now? What if I wait? What if I'm not ready? The thought of sending it terrified him. What if his father didn't respond? Or worse, what if he did, but the conversation reopened old wounds instead of healing them? But then he remembered Margaret's words, "Every moment is a chance to begin again." With a deep breath, Daniel stepped toward the mailbox. His heart pounded as he slid the letter through the slot, the faint sound of it falling inside sealing his decision. It was done. A sense of both relief and apprehension washed over him as he walked away. A familiar face. After grabbing a coffee, Daniel made his way to his gate. As he scanned the rows of chairs, he froze. Sitting near the window, looking out at the runway, was James. His broad shoulders were hunched slightly, his fingers drumming against his knee as if lost in thought. "James?" Daniel called out, approaching him. James looked up, startled at first, but then his face broke into a smile. "Daniel, what are you doing here?" "I'm heading back to San Diego," Daniel said, gesturing to his carry-on bag. "You? Back to Atlanta?" James replied, shifting to make room for Daniel to sit. "Mom's doing better, so I figured it's time to get back to work." Daniel hesitated before sitting down. "How's she holding up?" James smiled faintly. "She's a fighter, as always. The doctors say she needs to rest, but you know how she is. She's already talking about her next volunteer project." Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "That sounds like her." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching planes taxi on the runway. Finally, James broke the quiet. "You've changed," he said, his tone thoughtful. "When I first met you, you seemed closed off, focused only on work, but now it's like you're seeing things differently." Daniel considered this, then nodded. "I think I am. Your mom had a lot to do with that." "She has that effect on people," James said with a chuckle. Then he grew serious. "What are you going to do with it? This new perspective?" Daniel exhaled slowly, his hands resting on his knees. "I started by reaching out to my dad. I mailed him a letter just now, actually. It's scary, but it feels like the right thing to do." James nodded approvingly. "That's a big step. He's your family, and family's worth fighting for." Daniel looked at James, his respect for him deepening. "Your mom raised a good man," he said sincerely. James shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "She raised me to care. That's what she does." The ripple effect. When Daniel finally boarded his flight, he felt a mix of emotions: relief, hope, and a lingering sense of uncertainty. He had taken steps toward mending his relationship with his father, but he knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. Still, for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. As the plane ascended into the sky, Daniel gazed out the window at the clouds below. He thought about Margaret, her quiet strength, and her unwavering belief in the power of connection. Her influence had rippled through his life, prompting him to reevaluate his priorities and confront the parts of himself he had ignored for so long. A letter received. A few days later, Daniel's father sat at the kitchen table of his modest home, a stack of mail in front of him. As he shuffled through the envelopes, his hands paused on one with familiar handwriting. He stared at it for a long moment, his heart pounding. Slowly, he opened it, his eyes scanning the words. By the time he reached the end, his hands were trembling. The pain of their estrangement lingered, but so did the love that had never truly faded. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope, a small smile breaking through his usually stoic expression. He picked up the phone, dialing a number he hadn't called in years. A conversation that mattered. When Daniel's phone rang, he almost didn't answer. He was in the middle of reviewing a presentation for work, but something made him check the caller ID. Seeing his father's name on the screen made his heart skip a beat. He hesitated for a moment, then pressed accept. "Hello, Daniel," his father said, his voice gruff but tinged with warmth. "I got your letter." Daniel's throat tightened. "And?" There was a pause. Then his father said, "And I'd like to talk. Maybe we could meet, have dinner, catch up." Relief flooded through Daniel, and he smiled, his eyes misting. "I'd like that, Dad. I'd like that a lot." The start of something new. In the weeks that followed, Daniel began to rebuild his relationship with his father, one conversation at a time. It wasn't always easy. There were still wounds to heal and misunderstandings to work through. But with each step, they grew closer. He also found himself inspired by Margaret's example, looking for ways to connect with others and give back. He volunteered at a local shelter, started mentoring younger colleagues at work, and even reconnected with old friends he had lost touch with. Through it all, he carried Margaret's words with him. Every moment is a chance to begin again. A visit to Margaret. Months later, Daniel visited Margaret at her home, bringing a bouquet of daisies as a token of gratitude. When she opened the door and saw him standing there, her face lit up with delight. "Daniel," she exclaimed, pulling him into a warm hug. "What a wonderful surprise." As they sat together in her cozy living room, sipping tea and catching up, Daniel shared the progress he had made. The conversations with his father, the ways he was trying to give back, and the sense of fulfillment he had found along the way. Margaret listened intently, her eyes brimming with pride. "You've come a long way," she said, reaching out to pat his hand. "I always knew you had it in you." Daniel smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the woman who had changed his life. "You showed me the way, Margaret," he said. "I'll never forget that." As he left her home that evening, the stars twinkling above, Daniel felt a profound sense of peace. His journey was far from over, but he was finally on the path he was meant to walk, a path of connection, forgiveness, and growth. And for that, he would always be thankful. Closure and renewal. The crisp evening air greeted Daniel as he stepped out of Margaret's home, the faint scent of lavender from her garden lingering in the breeze. He paused for a moment on her porch, reflecting on how far he had come since that fateful flight. Meeting Margaret hadn't just altered the trajectory of his relationship with his father. It had changed the way he viewed the world and his place in it. Reunion. Weeks later, Daniel found himself standing outside his father's house. It was a modest, brick home with a front yard that had seen better days. The paint on the shutters was peeling, and the flower beds were overgrown, but the sight of it stirred a deep nostalgia in Daniel. It was the house where he had grown up, where his father had taught him to ride a bike, where they had celebrated birthdays and Christmases together. He adjusted his jacket and knocked on the door. His heart raced as he heard footsteps approaching. The door opened, and there stood his father, slightly grayer than Daniel remembered, but still carrying the same commanding presence. "Daniel," his father said, his voice soft with emotion. "Hi, Dad," Daniel replied, his own voice trembling. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the weight of years of silence filling the space between them. Then his father stepped forward and pulled Daniel into an embrace. It was a hug full of unspoken apologies, forgiveness, and love, and it shattered the wall that had separated them for so long. The dinner table. Later that evening, they sat together at the dining table, sharing a simple meal of roast chicken and mashed potatoes. The conversation was hesitant at first, but as they talked, the tension eased. They reminisced about old times, laughed about shared memories, and even shed a few tears. "I should have reached out sooner," Daniel admitted, staring at his plate. "I was stubborn, and I let my pride get in the way." His father reached across the table and placed a hand on Daniel's. "We both made mistakes," he said, "but what matters is that we're here now. We can start over." Daniel nodded, a lump forming in his throat. For the first time in years, he felt truly at home. A life reimagined. The weeks turned into months, and Daniel continued to nurture his relationships with his father, his sister, and even himself. He found new purpose in his work, using his skills to mentor younger colleagues and advocate for more compassionate leadership. He also started volunteering at a local community center, inspired by Margaret's tireless dedication to helping others. His transformation didn't go unnoticed. His colleagues remarked on how much more approachable and empathetic he had become. His family expressed gratitude for the effort he was making to reconnect. And through it all, Daniel felt a sense of fulfillment that no promotion or paycheck had ever brought him. One last visit. Nearly a year after their initial meeting, Daniel visited Margaret again. Her health had declined, but her spirit was as vibrant as ever. She greeted him with the same warm smile that had first disarmed him on the plane. "You're looking well, Daniel," she said as they sat together in her living room. "Life seems to agree with you." "I have you to thank for that," he replied, his voice thick with gratitude. "You taught me what really matters, Margaret. You changed my life." Margaret reached out and took his hand, her grip weak but steady. "No, Daniel," she said softly. "You changed your life. I just gave you a nudge." Tears welled in Daniel's eyes as he squeezed her hand. "I'll never forget you," he said. Margaret smiled, her eyes glistening. "And I'll never forget you." A new beginning. When Margaret passed away a few weeks later, Daniel attended her memorial service. It was a small gathering, but the room was filled with people whose lives she had touched. Stories of her kindness and selflessness were shared, each one a testament to the extraordinary woman she had been. Daniel spoke at the service, his voice steady but emotional. "Margaret didn't just show kindness, she was kindness," he said. "She had a way of seeing the best in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves. I wouldn't be the man I am today if it weren't for her." As he left the service, Daniel felt a deep sense of peace. Margaret's legacy lived on in the lives she had changed, and he was determined to honor her memory by continuing to live the lessons she had taught him. The final flight. Months later, on another flight, Daniel found himself seated next to a nervous young woman. She gripped the armrest tightly as the plane taxied for takeoff, her face pale with anxiety. Daniel noticed her trembling hands and offered her a kind smile. "Flying can be nerve-wracking," he said gently, "but it helps to breathe. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Like this." He demonstrated, and the woman followed his lead. Gradually, her breathing steadied, and the tension in her shoulders eased. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling but grateful. "I don't know how I'd get through this without you." Daniel smiled, feeling Margaret's presence in his actions. "Sometimes we just need a little help," he said. As the plane soared into the sky, Daniel looked out the window, the clouds stretching endlessly before him. He felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing he was carrying forward the kindness and wisdom Margaret had shared with him. It wasn't just a new chapter, it was a new story entirely. One rooted in connection, compassion, and the belief that it's never too late to begin again.